and welcome to another episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I'm your creepy host, Jaime Bennett. And because this is a show about haunted history and ghost stories, your discretion is advised. I'm going to be talking about Crenshaw among some other stories that come out of Marion, Illinois, and the surrounding areas. I'm also going to be talking about some ghost stories that come out of like St. Omar and a few other places. So, because this is on Easter Sunday, and I do apologize about that creepy ghost show on Easter Sunday. I didn't plan it that way, but I do have a surprise for you all. If you stick around to the end of the episode, there will be a surprise. So thank you very much for tuning in to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this episode. So the first story that I'm going to talk about comes from Tales of Illinois' Haunted Crenshaw House. I found it on a website called thehauntedplaces.com, Tales of the Haunted Crenshaw House. Due to nefarious tales of breeding and kidnapping, Crenshaw House is now said to be haunted by the free blacks who had once lived under horrible conditions in the mansion. Visitors who have toured Crenshaw House, they've reported sounds of moaning and wailing and just noises coming from the mansion's third floor. Indeed, two whipping posts believed to be punishment places for mutinous slaves were recovered from the mansion during a cleanup. In one incident reported by the American Ghost Society self-proclaimed exorcist, a person by the name of Hickam Whittington visited the haunted Crenshaw House and claimed to have encountered numerous ghosts of the slaves who had died in the house. That very same night, Whittington passed away from a sudden illness. Another legend tells of a huge door that was located in the mansion's rear wall. It provided a sufficiently large opening for a small wagon. It is said that every fortnight a wagon would drive up the driveway to the rear of the mansion before depositing its occupants. The women and men were then hurried upstairs to the third floor. The rumored doors had since been completely destroyed, and what remains is a large wall in the mansion's dining room. Here's a little bit of history of the Crenshaw House. It was commissioned by a local merchant and landowner by the name of John Crenshaw in the year of 1834. It is called the Crenshaw House, but it was formerly known as the Crenshaw Mansion. The residence for the Crenshaw house was Crenshaw and his family of 6. As a lessee of the state-owned Salt Plains, Crenshaw was one of the few citizens in Gallatin County who was allowed to keep slaves. This comes at a time when Illinois was one of the several free states that had banned slavery. However, salt work owners were exempted from the law and were permitted to use slaves for laborious job of hauling and boiling salt brine water from the local salt springs. As the owner of over 1,000 acres of land and 700 slaves, Crenshaw was one of the wealthiest individuals in the state. It was said that Crenshaw's taxes once amounted to nearly 1/7 of revenue of Illinois. Can you imagine that? That's just crazy. With his wealth, Crenshaw built the now famous Crenshaw House on top of Hickory Hill near the town of Equality. But in September of 1840, then State Representative Abraham Lincoln had made a trip to Gallatin County to attend several debates held in the area. Mr. Lincoln and several other guests then attended a social event at Crenshaw mansion, before spending the night there. But in 1850, the Crenshaw family moved to the town of Equality. For the next 16 years, the Crenshaw house was managed by a German family hired by Crenshaw himself. After Crenshaw's passing in 1871, the ownership of the mansion was then passed to his wife and his children. And in 1913, the Sisk family had purchased the Crenshaw house and had begun conducting tours on the property. After over 80 years of operation, the historic property turned museum closed down in 1913. And then in December of 2000, the Crenshaw house was sold to the state of Illinois for a sum of $500,000 and 10 acres. However, little upkeep has been done to the property. Crenshaw house is currently closed to the public and is due for a restoration. However, the project which includes an extensive renovation, a new road, some new parking lots, as well as new structures, is estimated to cost the state at least $7 million. This next story that I'm going to be talking about includes the Crenshaw house as well, but it also includes the reverse Underground Railroad. That's right, reverse Underground Railroad. While Crenshaw was allowed to have used slaves for his salt works, he and his business associate, James Ford, were accused of kidnapping and breeding free black escaped slaves in the free state of Illinois and then selling them to the state of Kentucky. In the mid-1820s, as well as the 1840s, Crenshaw was charged with the kidnapping of free black on both occasions. He was acquitted. The latter case involved Maria Adams and her 7 children, who were abducted and sold to a team of slave traders named Lewis and John G. Kindle. I'm sorry if I butchered that name. I'm not good at pronouncing names. Historical records later had revealed several other accounts of kidnapping by Crenshaw. And in 1828, Frank Granger and 15 other blacks were kidnapped and sold as slaves in Tipton County, Tennessee in the 1840s. Peter White and 3 other children were sold to a slave owner in the state of Arkansas for a sum of $800. How sad is that? $800. That's what they were worth, apparently. That's really, really sad. However, the 4 were rescued by Walter Wright. Thank goodness. The 4 were rescued by Walter White, a nephew of General Leonard White. Victims of Crenshaw's cruelties surfaced all over the slave states in South, including Kentucky, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Texas. The 3rd floor of the Crenshaw house was said to be a large hallway divided into 12 different room sizes. Or 12 different rooms of different sizes, rather. These rooms were rumored to be secret jail cells for the kidnapped, free black, and runaway slaves. However, the researchers have disputed the claim, suggesting that the cells may have been sleeping quarters. Nonetheless, the historic mansion has earned its name as the Crenshaw House, also known as the Old Slave House. But in 2004, the Crenshaw House was named as a station on the reverse Underground Railroad to acknowledge Crenshaw's horrible practice, as well as the mansion's role in it. Reverse Underground Railroad is a network of slave traders and human traffickers who abducted tens of thousands of free blacks from the North to sell them into slavery in the South. Stations were safe houses to hide the kidnapped. Lines were referred to the routes used for transportation of the abducted, and conductors were smugglers hired to complete the transfer. That makes me sick to even know that happened in our history. And with something that horrible happening, there has got to be haunted stories. That mansion is probably extremely haunted by, the spirits that can't get any rest because of the horrible conditions that they were in when they were alive. That's really, really horrible and really, really awful. The directions to the Crenshaw house, if anybody ever wants to visit it, like if they open it up to the public, or if you just want to see the outside of it, you can get there by going to the Crenshaw house from the Equality Township. You drive about 4 miles eastbound along Illinois' Route 13 before turning left into Route 1. Continue the drive for approximately half a mile. The Crenshaw house can be found on a hillside on the right side just before the Berry Best Tarps. The address for Crenshaw House is 4325 Crenshaw Lane, Equality, Illinois 62934. You can always view the property on Google Maps. So, or if you do research online, you can see Crenshaw House. I'm going to do my best to insert a picture or a clip of Crenshaw House for you all here. And on to the next clip. Story comes from the same general story that I was telling you in the prior clip. It takes place with the coal mine, and it takes place near the strip mine near Herrin, Illinois. So it happened on June 21st of 1922. Labor violence had erupted in the Southern Illinois Coal Company strip mine near Herrin, Illinois, like I said, and the United Mine Workers, or UMW for abbreviation, they were in the midst of the nationwide strike, but they had agreed to let their members of the Steam Shovelmen's Union remove dirt from the site. In mid-June, however, the shovelmen started loading coal. So in the strikers' eye, this made them scabs because they were removing coal and not dirt. So that was not a good thing to be in Williamson County, especially where 90% of the workforce, even the shopkeepers and farmers, held the UMW cards, the United Miner Workers cards. So fighting began on the morning of June 21st when a truckload of laborers were recruited from Chicago without being told that they would be strike breakers. They were stopped on the way to the mine, and accounts differed as to who shot whom first. But gunfire was exchanged on the road, and shortly after at the mine, one strikebreaker and at least 2 strikers were killed, and a third was mortally wounded. Within hours, Union men from surrounding communities were flocking to the mine, liberating guns and ammunition from stores as they went. A brief skirmish had convinced the men inside the mine that they were vastly outnumbered. So they had surrendered and had agreed to stop work in return for promise of safe passage out of the county. But on the morning of June 22nd, about 50 or 60 workers filed out of the mine with their hands held high. The strikers began marching them toward town, pausing, only to kill the mine's elderly people. One-legged superintendent whom they held responsible for the previous day's killings. After several miles, after miles and miles, the column reached a barbed wire fence, and by this time, whatever discipline had existed in the mob was completely gone. The scabs were then lined up against the fence and told to run for their lives. As they clawed desperately at the barbed wire fence, the Union men then opened fire. Some fell down to the ground dead, some were mortally wounded. Others escaped into the woods, where strikers continued to hunt them down. One man saved his life by giving the elk secret sign, and finding some fellow members among his would-be murderers. There were an unlucky few that were captured, marched to a cemetery, and shot. Those were still breathing, and those who were still breathing then had their throats sliced and cut open. The final death toll was 21, with most of the survivors badly injured. The massacre's follow-up, while less bloody, was nearly as dispiriting. Prosecutors obtained 214 indictments. But then the first few resulted in acquittals by sympathetic local juries. Then the rest were dropped. The strikers' victory was hollowed. However, repugnance over the massacre spread across the county, leading miners to desert the UMW by droves. John L. Lewis, the union's president, sent his men back to work under the old contract, and the dissension-racked UMW continued to lose power and membership through the rest of the 1920s. Sorry, y'all, I'm stuttering. I have a little bit of a cold. Can't pronounce things today, but hopefully that doesn't hurt, the telling of this story. The story that I'm going to talk about is some of the history of Marion, Illinois, because some of Crenshaw took place there as well. But living in Marion, Illinois in the 1920s would be considered living dangerously, and this comes from the Marion Republican. I found it when I was doing some research. An article that was originally written by Sam Lutka for the Williamson County Historical Society, which had been updated of August 16, 2017. And you can find this article that I'm going to be talking about on the Daily Republicannews.com. And it's with the Marion Republican. So life in Marion, Illinois, starting in the 1920s would have been a very scary time for a number of people and for quite a number of reasons. Even though Marion, Illinois had run wet and dry since the influence of temperance parties in the 1870s, the beginning of Prohibition in the 1920s was met with some amount of resistance. First, there were gang wars conducted in an attempt to gain control of alcohol in the county, which caused quite a bit of damage, as any war does. Secondly, illegal individual alcohol production in the form of stills, kind of can be compared to the meth labs of today. It would cause harm to those stumbling upon them or living near them. A nasty precedent got established within Williamson County in 1899 when mine owner Samuel Brush attempted to operate his mine near Cambria during UMWA strike. During that strike, Brush employed black non-union workers from Tennessee to work in the mine, which had ended up with the death of 5 of the miners in an ambush near Cartersville. The result was 0 convictions. A near identical set of circumstances had occurred in 1922 when a 22-year-old white non-union laborers were murdered for working at the Lester Strip mine on what is now Skyline Drive, north of Home Depot. Again, as in 1899, there were no convictions. This event had made national news headlines for months and marked Williamson County is one of the most dangerous places to live in the country. Can you imagine that? I used to live there, and that's why I'm talking about this story and why I decided to do Crenshaw, because I'm from Southern Illinois, and I used to live in Marion, Illinois, and it just blows my mind that it was considered one of the most dangerous places to live in the country at one point in time. It lived up to its name, Bloody Williamson, a reputation the county had earned in the 1870s during the Vendetta period. Just as gangsters of Chicago controlled illegal alcohol in Chicago during the Prohibition, the Burger Gang and Shelton Brothers controlled the region of Marion, Illinois. With two gangs battling over the same turf, it goes without saying that the peripheral damage occurred. Like, a lot of damage occurred. When the Ku Klux Klan appeared nationwide in the early 1920s, it was found as particularly fertile soil in Southern Illinois. It was really good soil in Southern Illinois. Marion and Williamson County, by the turn of the 20th century, were feeling the effects of a coal industry that was spurring phenomenal growth in the population and as well as its economy. This created an influx of immigrants who had begun arriving to work in the coal mines. Many Protestants of the time saw Catholic immigrants, much the way many people view Muslims today. Since most newly arrived immigrants had alien names, spoke only broken English, if any English at all, and had carried with them foreign ways of doing things, they were generally viewed with mistrust and suspicion. Ingredients that allow paranoia, and hatred to spread. As a result, these immigrants generally took one of two tactics. They would either located themselves in communities with other families from the same country, or they Americanized their names, adapted to a new language, and put ways of the old country far behind them in order to blend into their new community. Either way, immigrants were often singled out and targeted by the Klan enforcement. Since Marion is the county seat of Williamson County, any and all incidences involving the county were brought to the courthouse located on the Marion Square, or the Old Country Jail on South Van Buren Street. As a result, events that occurred in the county during the 1920s required calling out the Illinois militia a number of times to control rioting and keep the peace. That's hard for me to imagine. That's it's always interesting to go back into history and to hear these things, because when I lived there, I couldn't imagine any of that occurring there, but it did. It's right here in front of my eyeballs, and I'm reading it. And it's just amazing what you can find when you look back in history. On such occasions, the militia actually would take up temporary residence in the county courthouse. Personally, if I could go back in time to the 1920s, would definitely be one of those times that I would think about going back to. Like the author of this report, he said that he wouldn't go back to the 1920s. I would think about it. It does sound like a very dangerous time in Marion history, but it would be something to definitely think about. This reporter said that they definitely would not put it on their itinerary. And I can't really say that I would blame them, but it would be something to think about. History is interesting. And a lot of times, sad to say, it is sordid history, or, really tragic history. Of course, there are strip pits located out in Williamson County because of the coal companies that had happened there. So, with coal companies and mining come strip pits. And there have been bodies found in the strip pits of people who have drowned in the strip pits. I don't know too much about the strip pits history, but I have been told stories when I lived in Marion, Illinois. Um, and within my research, I did find a couple of young gentlemen who had actually drowned in the strip pits. It said that one gentleman had went in to swim or whatever and was drowning, and his brother or his buddy, his companion that was with him, tried to go in and rescue him and ended up drowning themselves. So they both ended up dying in the strip pit. Strip pit's definitely nothing to mess with. Like, you can't gauge the depth of a strip pit. And if you're not a very good swimmer, or even if you are a very good swimmer, you stand a chance of possibly drowning in one of those locations. And like I said, I have been told stories where they have found like bodies in the strip pit of, discarded individuals during the coal mining days there. I don't know how true that is. It may be hearsay, but you can imagine, like, with the horrible Herrin Massacre that had happened, and the prohibition history and the riot history and all of the horrible history that I had told you all about Marion, Illinois, that there is probably quite a few haunted locations around there, and not just at the Crenshaw house. If you really, really think about it, there are probably quite a few haunted locations just because of all the horrible history and torture that had went on there, killings and just pure torture that had happened. This next story has nothing at all to do with Crenshaw, but I thought it was an interesting story, and it is located in Illinois. It's about 2.5 hours from Marion, Illinois, and it is the story behind a ghost town cemetery located in St. Omer, Illinois. It's believed that there is a witch buried there, and it's in the remote part of the state. It is located in the east central region of Illinois, and it's located in a ghost town of St. Omer. It was a small town in the 1800s that was abandoned for the nearby town of Ashmore due to the new train line. So, like I said, it's located in the remote part of the state, and it is located in an abandoned town where all that remains is an ancient graveyard. And the local lore says that there is a witch's grave that has stirred up fear and intrigue for most ghost hunters and spiritualists alike. So I'm going to give you a little bit of history of this cemetery. There is controversy behind it, like any scary story, and some of the events that went down may or may not be true. You can decide for yourself. I came across this article when I was researching, the haunted history of Crenshaw. And like I said, this has nothing at all to do with Crenshaw, but I came across it and thought it was interesting enough, and thought that you all would probably find it interesting, hopefully. It only held about 50 or so families. Only about 50 or so families had inhabited the town. And by the end of the 1880s, though, it had only about 6 houses left, as well as a store, a post office, and a blacksmith. What was left behind was an old cemetery filled with grave markers from centuries ago in the village of St. Omar, which is located just south of a plot of land that's surrounded by creeks and forestries and miles of cornfields. Imagine that, miles and miles of cornfields in Illinois. Can't imagine that. It's what I'm used to growing up around. There was a discreet ghost town cemetery that had been kept up in part due to strange plot believed to have been a witch's grave. They kept it up because there was what they thought to be a witch's grave. Rumor has it that the witch's grave of Caroline Barnes, she was accused of being a witch in 1880s, and when she wouldn't die by hanging, they ended up burying her alive. There were actually 4 people buried there. Caroline's husband and his parents were placed there before her. But I'll get into that more, as the story progresses. But the gravestone is shaped like an orb on top of a pyre. And it lists an impossible date of her death, of like an impossible date of death for Caroline of February 31st, because legend says that it was made that way so that her spirit could not rise again. Folklore told that witches would rise on the day of their death. So they purposely put a wrongful death date on there so that she wouldn't rise up from her grave. The grave in the ghost town cemetery faces north and south, while most every other grave in the world faces east and west. The photographers who tried to film it claimed to be unable to take photos of it, and it is believed to glow on moonless nights. Candle wax, coins, and other remains suggest cult activity were also found. And they show pictures in this article. I will try my very best to get you stock photos so that you can kind of see what her gravestone looks like. But yeah. They found those things located on her headstone. Every story, of course, has 2 sides, and unfortunately, the alternative is equally as tragic in Caroline's story. Caroline's husband, Marcus, died in a sawmill accident. Goodness, I can't talk today. In a sawmill accident in December of 1881. And then she passed 2 months later from pneumonia at the young age of 23. Historians believe that her death actually happened around February 28th of 1882. And, her headstone actually said February 31st. So, see, wrongful death date because they were afraid that she would rise. So, you may ask, why did they mess up the date of her death on the stone? The skeptics speculate that it was a production error, that it was too expensive to correct, that it seems that the town died out with the passing of this particular family, so there was probably no one willing to fix it. But what about the fact that it was facing north and south? Typically, Christian burials dictate the feet should be facing the east. It's likely, though, that vandalism caused this. The grave has been found knocked over several times, and it is possible that it was not always set back in the proper direction. So that's pretty interesting. I would think that maybe she could have been a witch, or maybe it was just, hearsay. I think that this is an interesting story. I think that her headstone's interesting, and the fact that they find candle wax and coins and other things there, at least in the very least indicate that, other people believe that this could be the headstone of a witch. Finish this episode off by going back to the Crenshaw house, because, there's a lot of, history there. It is, terrifying history, and with terrifying history comes ghost stories and hauntings. And it's said that the Crenshaw house is among the most haunted places in the nation. Can you imagine that? That it's considered one of the most haunted places in the nation. And that's because of a lot of insidious, horrible things happen there. The story of Illinois' most haunted house is both terrifying and sorrowful. Like I said, it is linked with a terrible period in America's past. There is tales of ghosts and greed that is not well known, but it does figure heavily in the Underground Railroad movement, and not in a good way. Though we are called the land of Lincoln, there are always some bad apples that spoil a state's reputation of freedom and anti-slavery. Beginning in about 1790 and lasting until the Emancipation Proclamation in around 1860s, the Underground Railroad was a system of roads, trails, and tunnels used by the abolitionists and slaves who wanted to escape the South. The diabolical practice of slavery lasted for hundreds of years in America, and it has left the country with some very wicked hauntings. Around the same time of the anti-slavery movement, there was an increase in a demand for salt to preserve food. And there happened to be a large reserve of it in southern Illinois, where I am from. Originally, it was owned by the government. These salt reservations were sold off so that the state could afford to build more prisons. John Hart Crenshaw. We're going back to Crenshaw because this is where this story all began. He had bought thousands of acres of land and also owned a sawmill. I may be repeating some of these facts, but this is a interesting yet horrible part of Marion's history and Southern Illinois history. Like I said, he bought thousands of acres of land and also owned a sawmill. And 3 salt furnaces were used for processing. A couple of the saline springs along the Saline River made this southeast Illinois location ideal. So the river was even connected to the house, which was used for what many believe for horrendous crimes. Crenshaw had built his house on Hickory Hill, today known as the Old Slave House, in the 1830s. It was constructed in the classic Greek style with large columns, a balcony, and about 3 stories. Though it looks charming on the outside, what may have gone under its roof and within its walls was absolutely insidious. Though slavery was not technically legal in the land of Lincoln at that time, Crenshaw was one of just a few residents in the state who was licensed to keep slaves. The justification was that the work was so difficult that not enough free white men were willing to do it. Crenshaw had obviously made a good deal of money since he didn't have to pay wages. But his greed didn't stop with the few slaves he legally was allowed to own. He was responsible for kidnapping black families on the Underground Railroad, like I had mentioned earlier, who then he either sold back into slavery or kept as his own laborers. It was these events that had led to the Crenshaw house becoming one of the most haunted houses in Illinois, and certainly one of the most scariest in the nation. The attic of this place is divided into cells with barred windows, and there is no evidence on the walls. There is evidence on the walls of chains that were used to hold people captive. Goodness, I don't know what I'm thinking. I can't even talk straight today. But this story is very interesting. So, like I said, there were evidence of chains on the walls to hold people captive. No one knew exactly what took place behind the walls, but narratives depicting slavery in Deep South can give some clues. Slaves were often beaten, raped, and treated like animals. Ungodly sounds have been reported coming from the attic as far back as 1851. Right after Crenshaw had hired a German family to run the farm before selling it off in around 1864. It is believed that Crenshaw had upwards to around 700 slaves before things finally started to go downhill for him. After being indicted for kidnapping a black woman in around 1842, people started to become suspicious of his operations. This was in combination with better salt reserves discovered in Virginia and Ohio, causing his business operations to dwindle completely. Some of the rumors around Hickory Hill led to someone burning down one of Crenshaw's sawmills. There was also a rumor that Crenshaw had to terminate his business because he lost a leg. Legend says he was beating a black woman who was working in his fields when a black man hacked his leg off with an axe. The old slave home is located off Route 1, which I told you all earlier how to get there, and it's in the town of Equality, Illinois, which is in the tri-state area with Indiana and Kentucky. Over the years, the most haunted house has been open to visitors who have reported hearing cries, moans, rattling of chains, strange noises. Some had even experienced overwhelming feeling of fear or sadness, while others have felt cold chills and light touches. In around 1996, the Crenshaw house was shut down to visitors and sold to the state a few years after that. Currently, the grounds are off limits and trespassing is illegal. But as it's still the most haunted house in the state, it could reopen to guests someday in the future. So, like I said, I am from Southern Illinois, and, all these stories that I have told you all, it's astounding. Like, I can't imagine, when I lived there, I can't imagine that having happened in the past. And, sometimes when you do research on history of your town, you find, disturbing facts about your town. I never really was comfortable in Marion, Illinois. I lived in a town located near the Strip Pets and located near Crenshaw, called Wydash, Illinois. It was a really, really small town. I never really was comfortable there. I always got an eerie feeling when I lived in Marion, Illinois. I always got a feeling of dread. I never really felt like I fit in there. I never really felt like comfortable there. We lived in Wydash while I lived with my husband in Wydash for probably a couple of years, I would say. I think we moved there in like 2007, shortly before we were married in 2008. And then we ended up moving to Jonesboro, Illinois, which is where I'm from. The Lincoln Douglas debate actually happened in the square of Jonesboro, Illinois, which is an interesting part of history there. But anyhow, I ended up moving to Jonesboro, Illinois with my daughter and my husband and our sons. And we weren't in White Ash for very long. But I have to admit, when we moved to Jonesboro, I felt a little bit better about things. I didn't feel so stressed out. Maybe, Marion having that terrible past in the history left remnants of dread in the town itself, because I definitely didn't feel comfortable there. I don't own the rights to this story, and like I had promised, since this lands on Easter Sunday, and again, I apologize, I didn't plan it that way, but since it lands on Easter Sunday, why not have a scary story of the Easter Bunny, or, a scary Easter story? Like I said, I do not own the rights to this story, and it is written by Matt Blitz, and it was published on October 23rd of 2015. So all rights goes to Matt Blitz, and it is the scary, weird, somewhat true story of the Fairfax Bunny Man. Often with the urban legends, there's the story and there's the truth. That's what makes the tale of Fairfax County's Bunny Man so eerie, so bizarre, and so downright creepy. While there are several variations of the urban legend splashed across the furthest reaches of the internet, the true story of the Bunny Man may actually be even weirder. A creepy guy on Halloween, dressed oddly, throwing hatchets at people. It's just so bizarre to possibly be true, says Fairfax County archivist Brian Connolly. But it is. For 4 decades, the legend of the Bunny Man has captivated Northern Virginia fear seekers. Connolly first heard the tale when he was an area youngster in the 1970s. It showed up in 1973 University of Maryland undergrad's class paper. It has been told and retold by local teens for years. While the legend has evolved and changed through the years, it follows these lines. In the early 20th century, deep in the woods that divided the town of Clifton from Fairfax Station, there was an asylum for the insane. At some point, the asylum closed and the residents were piled into a bus bound for Lorton Prison. On the way there, the bus swerved and crashed. Many of the convicts escaped but were caught, save one, Douglas Griffin. While searching for him, authorities found a trail of half-eaten, gutted bunnies with many hanging from what was then called Fairfax Station Bridge. For months, the police searched for Griffin, but he was never found. Then on Halloween night, several teens were hanging out under the bridge. At the stroke of midnight, they were attacked. The next morning, they were found hanging from the bridge, gutted like bunnies. To this day, it is said that if you are at Bunny Man Bridge at midnight on Halloween night, you too will meet the fate of those teens and rabbits. It's a heck of a good piece of creative writing, Connolly says, about what he thinks is the most widely known version of the story. An account that follows this narrative from Timothy Forbes on castlespirits.com. On October 18, 1970, the Washington Post reported that Air Force Academy cadet Robert Bennett and his fiancée were sitting in a car on the 5400 block of Guinea Road in Fairfax around midnight near Bennett's uncle's house when a man dressed in a white suit with long bunny ears appeared. He yelled at the couple that were on private property, and he had their tag number. Then he threw a wood-handled hatchet through the front car window. Luckily, neither of them was hurt. 2 weeks later, the bunny man showed up again about a block away from his original sighting, according to an October 31st Washington Post article. Private security guard Paul Phipps spotted the man beast on the front porch of a new but unoccupied house. He was holding an axe. In the piece, Phipps recounted what happened. Next, I started talking to him, and that's when he started chopping, taking several swings at a pole on the porch. He threatened Phipps, "All you people trespass around here. If you don't get out of here, I'm going to bust you on the head." Connolly continued to dig. He tracked down the police investigation reports that confirmed that the Fairfax County Police looked for a male in his late teens or early 20s dressed as a bunny. The police were unable to turn up anything conclusive. Writing after a very extensive investigation into this and all other cases of the same nature, goodness, I can't talk, it is still unsubstantiated as to whether or not there really is a white rabbit. The police deemed the case inactive. Today, the story of the bunny man has overtaken the actual truth. There was no murder, no asylum for the insane, and not even a bridge. Connolly thinks the Fairfax Station Bridge, which Google Maps now even calls Bunnyman Bridge, was nothing more than a nearby local teen party spot and creepy-looking and potentially dangerous bridge that got incorporated into the story. Even the town of Clifton has fully embraced the legend with t-shirts and a haunted Halloween attraction. So welcome to the life of an urban legend. Sometimes they are true, and sometimes they are just that, a scary story. I hope you all have enjoyed this story, and I hope you all have enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening. So thank you very much for watching this episode of Belongs to the Shadows. I greatly appreciate it. And if you would like to leave any friendly comments on how I can improve this show, I love getting comments. I love getting criticism because how else am I going to know what needs improved on this show? I'm hoping that it gets better and better with each passing episode. I am looking for sponsors right now. So that I can actually go to the locations and do more filming on location and not have to use so many stock clips or so many stock photos. I am wanting to do an episode on Marie Laveau, so if I could get a sponsor for that, then I can be able to travel and actually film her gravesite and film some of the places in New Orleans and have a few stories from New Orleans. So that would be really, really wonderful. Or if you want to donate to the cause, although it is not required, I appreciate you all just tuning in and watching this show. But if you would like to donate, any donations that you make to me for this show will go for that cause. It will go for better filming equipment or travel expenses so that I can film on location. Thank you so much for watching this episode. Thank you so much for tuning in. I really appreciate you all. Until next time, love, hugs, and blessings.